20th anniversary meeting of the African Bird Club. My name is Keith Betton, I'm chairman of the club, and it's great to see so many of you here today. Before I go any further, let me point out where the emergency exits are. There's one there, you've just come through coming in, and there are two at the back if you need to head up that way. Well, we certainly needed a big venue for this meeting. We always knew we would, and I'm very grateful to the Natural History Museum for letting us have this facility today. It costs £2,000 to rent it, and they gave it to us for nothing, and I think that's superb. So a very big thank you to Ian Owens and Esther Murphy from the museum who've been so helpful in setting this up. Well, most of you will be ABC members already. Some of you are not, and non-members are very welcome today. We very much hope that you'll consider joining, particularly after you hear the work that we've been doing on birds in Africa. And I particularly want to welcome anybody who's come today who's an overseas visitor. I know Tony Wood, the president of BirdLife Zimbabwe, is here. Tony, I think that's you over there. If anybody wants to speak to Tony, he's very happy to talk to you later. We have a range of sales items, so do investigate those, in particular the goods from Wild Sounds, who will be giving a percentage of everything they take today towards ABC's funds, and everything goes towards the Conservation Fund. We also have a raffle, which you can buy things in. Lots of raffle prizes out there, including a superb print by Martin Woodcock. And again, all the money from that will go to the Conservation Fund. Well, it was back in 1993 when a group of people came together with the idea of founding this club. And I think the story of that is very well told in our latest bulletin by Bill Quantrill. And we owe a great debt of gratitude to those people who created the club, and some of them are here today. There are also our founder members. Now, I've actually got a slide. There are 3 slides that show you our founder members. You may be finding your name on here now. There are 3, so don't worry if you haven't seen your name yet. The first 2 slides show the people who actually signed up to be founder members of the club and paid extra to do so before the first copy of the bulletin even appeared. So that's superb. And the third slide is the people who joined shortly after that and were listed in the second bulletin. Just out of interest, I mean, I've seen lots of people who've said, I'm a founder member, because we've been writing to as many as we could find. And it was really funny. I was standing with one, and they saw another one, and they said, good God, I thought you were dead. So you may have had a conversation like that yourself. But I think it's tremendous to have so many founder members with us today. I'll just go back so the other people don't get upset. If you're a founder member, could I just ask you to stand up? If your name has been on the screen. Wow. Well, that is superb. Ladies and gentlemen, our founder members. It's great that you're not dead. Now, this is probably the most exciting slide that's going to be on this screen today, and it's the Hoop and Toy Public House around the corner. And I've actually taken the upstairs room for later after we finish this evening, and I hope many of you will join us there for a drink. I'm afraid the drinks have to be bought by you, but I've secured the room so we have a private area. So buy your drinks downstairs and then head up, and make sure they know that you've actually going upstairs, because if we spend enough money, I get the money back. So the founder members, when we break for lunch, it would be fabulous if you could actually come to the stage and we can get a photograph of you whilst everyone's going off and having lunch. It'd be just good to get a photograph of all of them together. So back in 1993, I think people had great ideas for the club. They thought it would do many things, but I don't think they had any vision as big as we ended up becoming. For example, last year we spent £33,000 funding or part funding 22 conservation projects in Africa. That means that since the club has been founded, we've spent £170,000 on projects in nearly 40 African countries. I think that's a great achievement, and we've been very fortunate that a number of people, some of them in the room today, have actually helped to fund that with personal donations where they've actually agreed to personally fund a particular project. And that has really taken us to where we are today. We couldn't have done it just by going around rattling tins and collecting money at the bird fair. So that is superb. So in our 20th year, I want to announce something very special. I think one of the greatest threats to birds in Africa, the rarest birds in Africa, is habitat loss. And it's something I don't think the club ever imagined when it was first started. But we want to do something really quite big. And what we want to do in our 20th year is we want to buy a piece of land, or part buy with another organisation a piece of land, and we're going to spend not less than £20,000 in doing that. We may in fact spend more than that in the end. But we have our eye on a piece of land. I can't talk about it today because it may just upset the negotiations, but there are two ideas we have. And I think we'll be able to come back to you in the next few months and tell you what we've done. You know, for me, it's that kind of activity that makes the club very, very important. That's how you make a difference, is by helping to save a critically endangered species. So any money you spend today on the raffle will go towards that fund to buy that piece of land. And if any of you feel moved to make a donation yourself to help us buy even more of the land, because it's a piece of land that could be bigger if we could get more money, if you feel moved to do that, then please have a word with me if you would like to make a personal donation yourself. Well, let's hear from the man who stood where I'm standing now 20 years ago at the very start. He was our first chairman, he then became our first president, and he's now our first vice president. He's a very modest man, one who rarely takes credit for his successes, but in the early days of the club, it was his leadership that gave us both the integrity and the direction that we needed. So ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Martin Woodcock.
Right. I'm very grateful to Keith for not pinching too many of the things I was going to say. Wonderful to see so many people. But despite what it says in your programme, I'm not going to have a nostalgic look back, because when I was thinking about this talk, I happened to look up what nostalgia meant in the dictionary. And it says it's a form of melancholia caused by prolonged absence from one's country or home. I thought that won't do, so I looked up in another dictionary, and it says it's a yearning for the return of past circumstances. But I can tell you that I remember only too well the struggle that Bar and I had with the club's stand at the bird fair, and I don't want to repeat any of that at all. Weighed a ton. We had it made of iron poles by a local engineering firm. Anyway, today is indeed the 20th anniversary of the first AGM, but for me the club is 21, because, and I don't want any heckling if I get these facts wrong, it's a long time ago, it was at the OBC meeting in December 1992 that the idea of an African club first cropped up in conversation with, I think, Richard Webb and John Fanshawe. OBC itself, of course, was our inspiration, and OBC got its inspiration from OSME, which in turn derived from the Ornithological Society of the Middle East, founded by Richard Porter in 1967 with William Wilkinson. So I regard Richard as the grandfather of the regional bird clubs. Anyway, after the meeting, a small group of us gathered to have a talk about the possibility of this club. I was very enthusiastic, and thinking hard about it, not paying attention to what was going on, suddenly found I'd been elected chairman of the launch committee. I have no records at all of what happened in the succeeding year, 1993, when all the meetings went on. Duncan tells me some of them were in his sitting room. He may well be right. The reason I haven't any records is because I didn't have a computer until a year after the first meeting, so everything was done by phone or fax. I know when I got a computer because I wrote to Rod Leslie on it, saying, I don't know what this thing is and I don't know how to work it. And nothing has changed since then. Of course, we couldn't have seen then, or foreseen, the dramatic changes that advances in computing, digital photography, and all that sort of thing would have for birders, let alone apart from anybody else. At that time, it was the phone and the fax and the snail mail, and it worked extremely effectively. Anyway, by July 1993, we'd started trawling for founder members. My first catch was Michael Irwin from Harare. And when the founder membership scheme finished at the end of 1994, over 250 people had helped to fund the launch of the club. The inaugural meeting was held in the Friends Meeting House in Euston, by which time we already had 376 members, of which 190 were founder members and 180 what were called standard members. Curiously enough, nearly 180 people turned up at that meeting. I expect they were all standard. And I see from the minutes that I was pompous enough to put the founding of the club into the historical perspective of ornithological research in Africa. Apart from that, it was a very good meeting. And by thoughtful prior arrangement, rather similar to what's happened today, we'd organised for a local pub to open specially early, and 180 people went there and did roaring business. At the end of 1994, membership had shot up to 801, with no less than 273 founder members. And then we had autumn meetings in Blakeney, which was a very good idea. We had about half a dozen of those with up to 100 people. And I think the demand sort of fell off because I can't trace one after 2002. A great pity, because very convenient for me. I was amused to see that in soliciting material for the bulletin in 1995, the editorial committee were inspiring contributors by urging them to take up your pens, pencils and paintbrushes and write, draw or paint your way into the bulletin's pages. A clarion call for the use of outdated technology, because in the very next issue, the same committee were having to explain what the internet was and suggesting if you didn't understand it, ask Alan Wilkinson, who very capably set up our website. So I'd started work on the birds of Africa in 1979 and had become, long before the club was founded, very aware of how compartmentalised African ornithology was and how the increasing flow of information wasn't generally available because of a lack of a suitable outlet. The concept of the bulletin totally changed this situation. How I wish I'd been able to take advantage of the early papers on things like identification of green bulls, Elodopsises and indigo birds. It was very heartening that the bulletin enabled many people who would never have dreamt or been able to publish in a peer-reviewed scientific journal such as Ostrich to make a significant contribution to African ornithology. Features such as Africa Roundup and recent reports gave an immediacy to what was going on in Africa. As I said, something which couldn't have been envisaged at the start was how the revolution in computing, communications and photography would develop. This has utterly and dramatically enhanced the birding scene, as we all know. None of us have quite kept up with the pace of things. Luckily, I have a whole raft of grandchildren who are teenage technocrats, and they can keep me in touch. I recommend grandchildren for that these days. The progress in digital photography, which has led to the wonderful bird image database, has been a complete revelation to me in particular as a bird illustrator. I so wish I could have been able to take advantage of that many years earlier. Ironically, it seems to have diminished the demand for illustrators, and I know of one who is apparently now a driving instructor. I began to doubt my own skills in volume 12 of the bulletin when I did a painting of an Arabian bustard on the jacket, and it was captioned Hubara. And then I felt much better when I looked at the back jacket and I found an immature night heron had been captioned an adult. So that was happy. Anyway, another area of rapid growth that has occurred since the club was founded, but nothing to do with it, has been how our views have changed and are changing on the classification of birds, only paralleled, I'm afraid, by the increasing threats to them. New species coming to light with advances in DNA are challenging our abilities in conservation. So the club exists at a pivotal time, and I paraphrase, some wag put it recently, 100 years ago, only wealthy people could go to wild places, and in 100 years' time, there'll be nothing to see when they get there. So conservation is a major issue, and in that area, the club has done wonders. Phil Atkinson pushed this forward when he was chairman with the various members of the Conservation Committee. And the fund was launched at the Pan-African Congress in Ghana in 1996 and grew quite slowly to begin with. But the £1,000 we could afford to donate for 1999 seems to have grown up about 30 times more now. As Keith said, the total we've dispersed is something like £170,000. Absolutely astounding. The bulletin was always envisaged as the main attraction for members with its club news, country reports, features and so on, but advances in technology have meant a huge added benefit in so many ways with the website, the image database, country checklists, the email discussion group, merchandise sales online. None of these things was on the horizon in 1992. Less obvious to members has been the expertise needed to cope with the mundane but essential task of actually running the club, coping with such things as our charitable status and its statutory requirements. I'm full of admiration for all the people who are competent to cope with this. I must acknowledge again the huge help I had when I was chairman from Richard Webb and Bill Contrell. We have been fortunate in persuading many people to manage the nitty-gritty of keeping the accounts, organising meetings, maintaining the membership, soliciting country reps, selling the club's merchandise, manning the stand at the bird fair and so on. All these things take up a huge amount of voluntary time, and there always seems to be somebody willing to help. The article by Bill Contrell in the current bulletin admirably sums up the progress and achievements of the club in its first 20 years. On a more personal, if not nostalgic note, I have to say I think I was very lucky to have been in at the beginning. I've been obsessed with Africa since childhood and had often dreamt of exploring there and made my first visit there 53 years ago. My most embarrassing episode as chairman happened while I was in Africa. I wasn't going to bore you with it, but it might help to use up my 15 minutes. During the Pan-African Congress, there were some field meetings. And on one of these, Barbara and I went with Stuart Keith and Emil Urban and their wives, and we were bused to some remote village where we were given a guide and invited to walk up the steep local hill, which was a sacred site for the village. Some of us got to the top. Anyway, after an hour or so, we came down. I was perspiring very freely, completely out of breath, filthy dirty, and there on the football pitch, the entire village had assembled, sitting down in a semicircle, with the paramount chief in a chair in the middle, with a mace bearer beside him, big chap, legs astride, 6-foot solid gold mace, and an interpreter. And the chief made a long speech welcoming us, and he said he'd like to know, the village would like to know who we were, what we were doing, and how we could help the village. And there was a silence, and we all looked at each other because the response was obviously called for. And Stuart and Emil, as one man, said to me, "You're the chairman, you do it." So I had to stand up in my dishevelled state by this gentleman, all his wonderful robes and the gold mace and everything, and the interpreter, and extemporise. And I can tell you that the only good thing about having an interpreter is it gives you just enough time to think what you're going to say next. Anyway, I was covered in confusion, and I think I had at the back of my mind the fact we'd just launched the Conservation Fund, because I said, something about, noticed your road is not in very good condition, had ruts about 8 feet deep, and maybe we can help you with that. Possibly we could help you with a new school building or something. And this was all videoed by Lois Irvin. I tried to buy that, to have it destroyed without success. Anyway, after we left the village, there was no way of getting in touch with them. We didn't know where we'd been. And as far as I'm aware, the club has never had a demand for a new school building or a road, which is very fortunate because it would have cost a lot of money. Anyway, back to less exacting times. I think Keith's tenure as chairman has been outstandingly successful, and with his wide range of contacts, he's given the club a much higher profile, which it thoroughly deserves. I think it's absolutely wonderful now. And we are also, of course, extremely lucky to have Tasso Leventis as the president. I couldn't predict the future in 1992. I've always been very bad at that. And I can't now. But I think the club has opened an entirely new era in African ornithology, and it will be exciting and fascinating to see how things develop. Thank you.
Thank you, Martin. Well, if we do get a request for a school, we now know where to go. Well, the next speaker is Achilles Byurahanga from Uganda. He's the Executive Director of Nature Uganda. He led the team that identified the IBAs in Uganda, and he sits on BirdLife International's council representing the African Partnership. But outside of Nature Uganda, he's chairman of the Bwindi Mangahinga Conservation Trust. That was set up to provide sustainable financing to the mountain gorilla conservation work. He's involved in the Nile Basin Discourse, a civil society network promoting cooperation and sustainable utilization of the Nile Basin's resources. But currently he's on leave in the UK, studying a course in conservation leadership at University of Cambridge, which is good news for us, which means we can hear from him today. Today he's going to tell us about BirdLife's plans, and in particular, the state of Africa's birds. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Achilles Byurahanga.
Thank you very much, Keith, and thank you very much, members, for inviting me to come and give this presentation. Although I'm already here in Cambridge and in London, but I think I represent quite many people from Africa who have not managed to come. So thank you very much for inviting me to this event. I'll be giving a presentation on the state of Africa's birds. It is based on a report which was published in 2012, looking at how far we have gone in the conservation of birds in Africa. So it's a report that is published, but I will be mixing it up with my own experiences from Uganda as well. So you'll see quite a number of examples from some of the work that we have been doing in Uganda. Okay, this is going to be the outline of my presentation. I will talk briefly about the development of BirdLife International Partnership, and then look at the state of Africa birds, the threats and responses, and then I will conclude with some insights of what I think on future prospects of bird conservation in Africa. The BirdLife Africa Partnership started around, and I'm saying around 1994, but in 1993 there were already some contacts already. But in 1994 we had the founding organizations, 7 of them. BirdLife South Africa, Nigeria Conservation Foundation, Wildlife Conservation Society of Tanzania, Nature Kenya, Nature Uganda, Ghana Wildlife Society, and Ethiopia Wildlife and Natural History Society. These were the original 7 members of BirdLife Partnership in 1994. But has grown since then from the 7 members to now 25 members. And we are hoping to add another 5 in the next 5 years. And I guess if I'm invited again in 20 years' time, probably the whole of Africa will be covered in green. Maybe we shall have covered the whole of Africa. We have a Council of African Partnership, which brings us all together. And the names that you see on the screen are the different people who have been chairing or leading the African Partnership in the last 15 years. We have changed leadership 15 times in the last 20 years. So we are kind of breaking in the African tradition where you either have to stay forever or you have to be thrown out. But at least we have been able to change leadership democratically. Mark Anderson at the bottom of the map from South Africa is the current chairman. Okay, so let's go to birds. As Martin and Keith have already mentioned, Africa is quite highly biodiverse, not only in terms of bird species, but in different groups of plants and animals and insects. And what the map shows are the different areas which are richer than the others. The dark places are areas which are more rich in terms of bird species. So the Guinea-Congo area in the western part of Africa, the Afro-Montane area in eastern Central Africa along the Arbatan Rift as well, and down towards southern Africa. But this map where says many species in one area, but each part of Africa is good and unique in different ways. So it is very difficult to say this part is more important than the other. But in terms of numbers of species, yes, that's what we can see. And the BirdLife Partnership has identified some of the areas that are important for conservation of birds. 1,230 sites have been identified as important bird areas. Again, these are areas identified as important because of prioritization. It's not to say other areas that are not identified as important bird areas are not important, but with meager resources, if you are going to invest somewhere to protect some of the globally threatened or some of the endemic species or some areas that are highly threatened, then these are the areas that we can focus our attention on. We've got 1,230, but quite new sites are still being identified even now. And this richness of species is already, it is part of the African culture. Birds have been used over ages to identify different things. They can help to tell about weather, they can help to tell about time, they can help to tell about different things. We use them in ceremonies, we use them in medicine, and so on and so forth. So birds are part of the Ugandan, of the African culture. But also, birds have been identified as important indicators of other groups of plants and animals. A study which was done in East Africa with 228 important bird areas in Ethiopia, Kenya, Tanzania, and Uganda did indicate that important bird areas covered total species diversity of endemic mammals, endemic snakes, and endemic amphibians. In Uganda, we did a similar analysis, and we found if we conserved important bird areas, we would capture more than 87% of the total biodiversity in Uganda, at least as we know it today. So looking at birds, they can help us to identify where other important plants and animals and other things are in the ecosystem. But some of these species are in trouble. BirdLife classifies the extinction risk of all the world's birds, and they've done for Africa as well. And in 2012, assessment concluded that out of 2,355 bird species, 245 are globally threatened. 89 of those are endangered, and 29 are critically endangered, meaning that they face extreme high risk of extinction in the wild. The photograph which I've used here is for the Taita Palis from Kenya, which is known to exist in probably less than 250 hectares of fragmented forest. So quite a number of species in Africa, though beautiful and people are talking nice about them, but they are facing great danger. When we started identifying the important bird areas in Africa in the 1990s, we had a list of globally threatened species at that time. And these species have continued to be threatened. And in fact, in the last 10 years, we have added on the list more 25 species that are threatened. So we are not getting any better. Species which used to be quite common and widespread, like Batra eagle, martial eagles, are now on the list of globally threatened species. And vultures, which also used to be widespread, equally threatened. 7 out of the 11 vulture species that we have got in Africa are already on the list of globally threatened birds. So things are not good, as you can see the red list index graph on the map on the screen. An analysis at global level was done also for the migrant species, looking at those that are moving around Africa, the Afrotropical migrants, and the Palearctic migrants, the intercontinental long-range distance migrants. And the picture is the same. They are all declining. Although the Palearctic migrants are declining a bit faster, but the trend is actually the same. So, which means we are looking at not only a problem for birds alone, but there may be a bigger problem in the wider environment that is causing this problem. As I mentioned, I will give some examples from Uganda. One of the groups of species that we have not focused on in Africa are species that live in towns. Species that are either still living in towns where it is, heavily settled now, or species that are being sucked into the city. Those who have come to Kampala must have seen the Marabu stock. The breeding Marabu stocks in Kampala we started monitoring them in 1969 by my colleagues. And there were about 10 nests in that time. But now we have got over 1,000 nests within the city. I think we have got the biggest breeding population of Marabu stocks in Africa, in Kampala city. And they're nesting everywhere. As you can see, this picture, I took it from Bank of Uganda. That's the logo of Bank of Uganda. They just nest at the main entrance. So everybody's going to the bank anyway. But we have also been monitoring some other small birds, like weavers. We used to look at weaver colonies. You would see them around Kampala city, around the city center. But we have also started seeing the colonies moving away from the city. So while the marabus are being sucked in, and the vultures, actually, the hooded vultures, we have got many hooded vultures in town, but the small birds are getting out. But there's another risk between these birds. The marabus is at the gate of Bank of Uganda, but the weavers have actually managed to get onto the knots. So that is the black-headed weaver nest on the 5,000 knot. We have got the crowned crane, which is also on the knots. The crowned crane has managed to be on the Ugandan flag, and we call it the national symbol as well. But this is not protecting the crane in any way. The population index indicate that we have lost nearly 80% of the individuals that were seen in 1970s in the last 30 to 40 years. So although national symbol, although they are in the bank, although they are on the national flag, but in the field, they are declining quite heavily. We have recently carried out a small study on the gray-crowned cranes, and we used to think that habitat destruction was the main problem. Indeed, it is still the main problem. But we have also found it is used in local medicine and witchcraft, and at local level, it must be a big, facing a big bit of pressure from local uses. Coming back again to the important bad areas, when we identified them in the 1990s, less than half of them had some form of protection. This has increased a little bit. Nearly 60% are now protected, or they've got some form of protection, wholly or sometimes partially. But we still have 40% which do not have any form of protection at all. And again, BirdLife has done some simple analysis to look at the status of IBS in Africa. And there is a long list of IBS which are called IBS in danger, those which are likely to lose their values, their qualities for being important bird areas. But does getting these sites on the list actually protects the species? It's something that we need to look at, whether just getting a site as a Ramsar site or as a reserve or something like that would actually save the birds or save the species. Using an example from Uganda, again, we have been monitoring water birds for the last 20 years. And I tried to go through the data to find some more evidence. This is a species which I think we all know, the pied kingfisher, which is quite widespread. And looking at our data, the numbers have actually been increasing since 1990s when we started monitoring these birds, which is quite good and interesting. But if you zoom into this data and you separate it into sites that are protected and sites that are not protected, then you see a different picture. The black diamonds are are records in the sites that are protected or that have got some form of protection. The red squares are sites that are outside protected areas. So using just this common species, it would look like maybe getting these sites onto the protected list helps a little bit. We also looked at the fish eagles again, which is a common bird, and has the same trend. The red squares this time are in protected areas, and the black circles are outside protected areas. And again, shows the same picture. Outside protected areas, the numbers are the same or declining, but in sites where there is some bit of conservation status, the numbers are stable or at least increasing. Right, so what is the problem? What is the pressure? What is causing these species to decline or become threatened? This is an analysis that was done at global level, but it was the same picture in Africa. All those different circles are different pressures. The bigger the circle, the bigger the pressure, the bigger the problem. And as you can see, one of the biggest problems, and it's already been mentioned, is agriculture, habitat destruction because of agriculture extension through crops or livestock or tree growing as well. Others including deforestation, logging, hunting, and trapping for trade or for subsistence eating. And I think last year we saw the big long lines of nets in Egypt trying to pick these birds for food. Invasive species have been a problem, especially in the island states, and so many others. Infrastructure development as well. The one other threat that we are starting to be aware of is climate change. That is going to be a problem, especially for species that are unique or endemic to certain habitats. A small study was done in the Albertine Rift along the Alberta Rift in Uganda, Burundi, and Rwanda, to look at the impact of climate change over time, using the endemic species in that region. Although this was just a model, it was just based on modeling, but it gave us some indication of what is likely to happen in the next 50 or 100 years. And just from the map, the color codes, red is where the species are concentrated now, and green is where the species are in low numbers because of altitude. But using this model, down at the bottom, it indicates that by 2085, probably there will not be favorable habitat for this species in the next probably 50, 100 years. So we are likely to lose these bats if the model is correct. So it is something that we need to look at, and it's not something that we can do very much about in Uganda or in Africa alone. This is a global problem, and I think in a different forum they are doing something about it, hopefully. Other pressures are from development programs. In Africa, we are all looking to development. All countries want to take off in terms of economic development, and we are mining and exploiting all resources and inviting all sorts of investors to come and help us to grow. In the process, I think we are going to make some mistakes, because some of the proposals that were evaluated on some of the important sites indicated that the proposals were either not good, they were not viable, or they were not good alternatives. And you must have heard the story of the Lake Natron in Tanzania for the lesser flamingos, or the Mabira forest in Uganda for sugarcane growing, or the Delta, Tana River Delta in Kenya, and there are other examples that you can identify in Africa where different proposals are being made, but are not well looked into to make sure that what we are going to do is a better alternative than what the sites are providing now. So this Mabira forest, which I've just mentioned. Then what are we doing about it? Of course, when we talk about conservation in Africa, we talk about advocacy. And indeed, advocating for good policies, advocating for protection of sites and species. But sometimes in Africa, we are working in completely different conditions from probably where you guys come from. Sometimes it's a bit difficult situation. Do not think those guys are actually sleeping, because sometimes when they open their eyes, their movements are completely unpredictable. And this is what I think, in my own view, that's going to be a big challenge in the future, because it's not that we don't have good policies in Africa or many parts of Africa. We have got very good policies. In Uganda, we've got very good policies of conservation and environmental protection, but nobody cares about the policies. If they want to do something, they will just go and change them tomorrow and do whatever they want to do. So whereas we are thinking about advocacy, but then we need to look at how we domesticate advocacy in situations that we are working with. However, from my own experience, I have found that good information can help. If you have got very good information, you can actually put up a fight sometimes. And that's what helped with Lake Natron, that's what helped with Mabira, that's what helped with the Delta. If you have got very good information, you can actually raise some voice, and often sometimes they listen. I also think that there has not been a lot of investment in this area of conservation in Africa. I think we are trying to milk a lot more than actually feeding the cow. Because if you look at most of the conservation areas, even national parks, are not in well condition. They're not well protected. In Uganda, for example, we have discovered oil, so we are going to be oil sheikhs soon. But the oil has been discovered, or much of the oil has been discovered in the national parks. But nobody wants to listen about whether this is a national park or not. What they want is the oil. So, although we may have protected areas or conservation areas, there's not much attention. We just think about getting money, but not putting in. But we have some more people who have got interested in putting money into conservation. I've just identified two donors, CPF, Critical Ecosystem Partnership Fund, which has put in about $9.5 or $9.8 million in the Afro-Montane area, supporting different initiatives. MacArthur Foundation has identified what we call the Great Lakes region. They're going to be supporting some initiatives, but I think across Africa we need more support in this form, looking at bigger landscapes and bigger ecosystems for conservation. I think I should say something nice about species as well. Several decades ago, some of these species you see on the screen were almost extinct. I think some people had given up on them. But with some hard work in some of the countries, particularly in Seychelles and in Mauritius, some of these species are coming back. The magpie robin, which was, I think, a couple of individuals, now has been downlisted from critical endangered to endangered. Well, it is still threatened, but at least there is some positive thing that we can say. If you put in enough effort, we can actually save most of these species. But we don't need to wait until there are a couple of pairs or a couple of individuals before you can start putting in some effort. We have also seen intergovernmental organizations in Africa coming up. I've identified two here, Abidjan Convention and Nairobi Convention, specifically because of the marine ecosystems, which have been missing quite a lot in most of the protected area systems. And we think probably working with them could help to put conservation agenda onto the convention priorities. BirdLife International is already in contact with some of these, and we hope that they can start looking at conservation as one of the priorities for the conventions. Our colleagues in South Africa have been working with the fisheries industry to try and develop best practices for fisheries, so that maybe we can reduce on the fish seabird bycatch because of these long lines and nets that the industry has been using, and we hope this will make some improvement. We understand some more of those industries are interested, but there are so many other industries that we need to look at. I've already mentioned oil, but there are lots of other things that are happening. I was talking to Roger just before the meeting, and there's a lot of mining in Madagascar, for example, and we need to look at how we can work probably with some of these industries to reduce their impact. In Uganda, you're not going to tell our president not to mine the oil. No, he's not going to listen to that. But probably we can come up with some suggestions on how best we can get the oil but cause minimum damage to or less damage to conservation. Well, the examples we have in Africa are not the best, and they keep on telling us that we have learned we are not going to make the same mistakes, but they're already making the same mistakes even before the oil comes out of the ground. Okay, and I also think as we move into the future, linking biodiversity conservation with human well-being is going to be extremely important for us. I mean, when you go to African communities and you talk about bird conservation, they will be asking you lots of questions. You know, bird conservation for what? Do we eat them? Do you want us to eat them? Do you want us to trap them? In fact, a number of sites I went for surveys, people would come to ask me whether I want some birds, whether they can go and capture some birds for me. because they don't see why somebody should spend a lot of time, with binoculars and telescopes looking at birds. But we are seeing some awareness coming up, young boys and young girls coming up with a lot of interest in birds and bird watching. And I think we can build on this and increase awareness, not only on birds as birds, but also biodiversity and how they link with the livelihood of people. And there are quite a number of community projects that have been implemented, and there are quite a number of sites outside protected areas which are now being looked after by communities. So there is an opportunity here that we can take to get the local communities get engaged in the conservation of nature, of biodiversity. Another opportunity that we have been looking at is transboundary initiatives. We first saw this a couple of years ago in Southern Africa, but in 2010 we again saw two presidents coming together to sign an agreement to protect a site between their countries, which they call the Peace Park, that is Sierra Leone and Liberia. And if you can get some of our leadership to start recognizing that actually they have got a role to play, and not only that only their countries can make it on themselves, but cooperation between countries in the region can make a difference. I think it will be a very big step to move forward, to convince our leaders that actually they can make a difference, and nature can also contribute to economic development, to poverty alleviation. See, this is the Upper Guinea forest, and the picture is the president of Sierra Leone and Liberia, which we think we can build on. Many times we have got these kind of nice photo opportunities, but then they don't do anything. But at least we can follow up on these kind of activities. Good. So thank you very much. We have got an African proverb which says that if you want to move very quickly, you move alone. If you want to move very far, you move together. I think we are together in it, and it looks like we are going far. But I need to make some small modification of this one. We need actually to move quickly together for some of the sites and some of the species that are in danger now, because we need to catch up before they get lost. So thank you very much for listening.